Guys, the amount of mad I am right now for having to sit here and troubleshoot my computer for the past 2 hours in order to record a 5-minute video. I'm going to try to be as happy and chipper as normal, but I'm sorry. Well, maybe it's ironic that it's taken so much work for me to get this video together and to get my computer working, because today's lesson is about work, and it's about the idea of work itself. Now, okay, let's go ahead and get this out of the way, that like the whole idea of 7 deadly sins and sloth and all that kind of stuff, that's not like scripturally a thing necessarily. It's something a bunch of people kind of extracted from the Bible. But the reality is that the idea of just simply not wanting to do something is something that's talked about an awful lot in the Bible. And that's there for several different reasons. Now, I'll start out by saying that in today's lesson, I'm going to kind of talk to you a little bit more, and then there's only going to be one discussion card here because there's a little bit more scripture to go through. But I'll start out with this. When I was doing youth ministry, I always remembered that I'd get this interesting comment back from a number of parents where they would sit there, and some of them, ironically, not the ones who ever ended up becoming the best churchgoers, would end up coming up to me and saying, well, you know, I would try to encourage my kids more to like go to church and to, you know, be a part of things, but I just don't want them to grow up resenting the church. Now, the sarcastic quip I would always have in the back of my mind, I would never say it out loud, was, well, you don't have to worry about your kids resenting church because they're never at church. But all of that aside, what really I was sitting here thinking was that, you know, I at the time, like, hey, I don't have kids. I definitely don't have teenagers, but I know that if you give an adolescent 2 options, one of them is do a thing and the other one is don't do a thing, almost always they'll choose the option of don't do a thing. That's just kind of the way a lot of them are geared. Not all of them, so don't come back with me and send me messages that my kid's different, because yes, I know, your kid is a precious little daffodil. But most kids, that's kind of how a lot of them think, you know, at least at that kind of adolescent age. Well, I think what ends up happening is that as adults, a lot of adults kind of get the same way. They have things they want to do. You know, the idea of recreation and leisure is something that we all feel entitled to, but when it comes to doing things that we think are work, a lot of times we suddenly become the Houdini of coming up with excuses for why we don't want to do something. But the reality is that scripturally, doing a thing is actually something that you're going to find from cover to cover. You find it in the very beginning of Genesis. Like before sin even entered into creation, I want you to think about this, there was work that God had for Adam. Like, I want you to go do this thing. I want you to go and care after creation and all that. Not only that, but keep in mind that in the very beginning, it was that man was created in God's own image. Well, what was God's image at the time? God was the creator. He was doing things. He was working, and you know he was working because on the last day he rested. So in other words, what you have is you have man being created in God's image who is actively working. So you can see that the idea of doing a thing was absolutely a part of it from the very beginning. So it's a part of your design. You know, one of the other things that you end up having in here is this idea that, you know, it's a part of God's mission for us. The idea that God has things for us to do. You saw this with Noah, right? That just to cherry pick an example, that God turned around and said, Noah, I have something I want you to do, and this is what it's going to be. But what you end up seeing in there is that there's going to be a blessing in this. So it's that there's a calling. It's more than just a chore. It's an actual purposeful calling that you have, and that is your mission, and that's what you're called for. You see this also in how Christ commissioned the disciples. That Christ commissioned the disciples, I'm calling you to go out and do these things. I'm calling you to go out, you know, amongst the wolves. So be as shrewd as snakes and as harmless as doves. And he goes and he communicates all this stuff, that there is a mission to take place. But what you end up seeing there is in that commissioning of those disciples, that to he who holds faithful, the same shall be saved. So you can see that there is something in there to, you know, there being purposeful work. That work is not intended to just be drudgery or chores. It's supposed to be something that is purposeful. Something that you see James talk about, that you'll see here in a second, is he talks about kind of the virtue of work, and that work is a virtue unto itself. That the reality is that work is something that causes you to kind of like really think about what it is you're being called to do. Let me put it this way, and this is really how James puts it. If you were to sit here and just admire admire the theology of God, just talk about God, but then you didn't do anything with that, then how much would that actually stick with you? Like, how much would that be built into your DNA? But you see, doing things with your faith is what actually causes you to be somebody who kind of stops and goes, you know what? Okay, I kind of get it. This is who I am. This is what I do. I see my identity is wrapped in more with this. You know, I'll sit here and say there's this interesting like procedure I have to do to lock up the lab that I work in during my day job. And there's an interesting thing where there's these little status lights. And when the status lights will turn a certain color whenever it's good for me to sit here and, you know, go on my merry way. But I have this notoriously bad short-term memory, and so I'll always forget, like, wait, did the light turn the right color? So here's what I'll do. When it turns the right color, I physically press my finger up against it, not because it does anything, but just that feeling, that physical sensation of like digging that little LED into my fingertip. That does remind me, oh yeah, I already did that thing. And I want you to think about that when it comes to your faith, because if your faith is nothing more than just kind of a glance over to the side that you do once a week on a Sunday, then it's not going to stick with you. But doing the work of Christ is something that is permanent. It's something that sticks with you. The last thing that I have over here, if you ever wonder why I'm glancing over here, I have notes over here, is the fact that, you know, Paul talks about work as something that should be desire. It's something that we should be joyful in doing. Now, I'll sit here and kind of mention, I'll hit this a little bit kind of after the discussion break, but you know, you can certainly work just for the sake of work, and that's not what's being discussed here, but work that is purposeful, work that is based on the fact that I was built for this, God made me this, and also work that's based on I'm on a mission, God called me to do certain things, and work that is also based on the fact of like I want to connect with my faith. That work is something that leads to contentment and joy. So what you can see in all of this is as easy as it is to sit here and say, I don't want to do something, whether that something is volunteering, whether that something is helping out a neighbor, whether that something is doing something in your community or your church or whatever it may be. It's so easy to find excuses to say no. But what you end up looking at when you look at the scriptures is that there's immense blessing and purpose in doing work when you're willing to actually answer the call. I teased a little bit before the break there, but I want to make certain to add a little bit of levity here, because I have no doubt that as we sit here and we start talking about why, you know, you need to pay attention to actually, you know, being willing to work and not shrinking away from things, zero doubt in my mind that somebody either said or thought about the fact that, well, you don't want to be all about work, because it's not all about work. I mean, you got to think about you, right? You know, you got to think about, you know, your own kind of mental health and all that kind of stuff. And just because that's kind of socially the way a lot of people process things. But when you sit here and you look at scriptures, you kind of see something very different. But here's what you do see that adds a little bit of levity to this. You see very clearly it being articulated, my favorite place is by Solomon in Ecclesiastes, about over focus on work and people who try to find satisfaction in the work itself. And he talks about how worthless it is and how it's not really pointless. And it leads to this phrase that pops up several times in Ecclesiastes I love, where he says, what more is there for a man to do than eat, drink, and enjoy his toil? For these are also blessings from God. And what you're seeing described in there, Solomon say that if you're pursuing work just for the sake of working, it's not really meaningful. But that's not what we were talking about. We're talking about work that you do because you say, I was built for this. God called me for this. That it's something that I'm doing the work that I feel like helps me to live out my faith, so I connect with it and I'm doing it joyfully. It's a different kind of work than what Solomon's talking about. And the final thing that I'll point out to you is something that you end up seeing, and I like the Luke account of it, but between Mary and Martha. When you see Mary and Martha, these two individuals that were going to host Jesus, you see Martha running around doing all this work everywhere, but then you see Mary seeing Jesus and immediately stopping what she's doing and going over and spending time with Jesus. And you see what she was doing is she understood that the purpose of the work is just as important, if not more important, than the actual work itself. While Martha kept on toiling, Mary realized that I have the Savior right here, and He's the one for whom I am working, so why would I not spend time with Him? So yes, you can overwork yourself, and you can absolutely put too much of an emphasis on work. But in our very culturally relevant and, you know, kind of in the current time in which we live way, don't fall into that temptation of sitting here saying things like mental health and sitting here saying things like, well, you got to think about you and all that kind of stuff, and using those as scapegoats for what, if we're being honest with ourselves, is probably just an unwillingness to do a thing, especially when that thing may be something that God is calling us to do. So maybe think about what God is calling you to do. Is there something in your life that God has been maybe pulling you towards, or maybe convicting you about? Or maybe there's something that if you were to search your own heart, you realize, I've been avoiding this because it just seems like a hassle. It just seems frustrating, or maybe it seems intimidating. Those oftentimes are the words of the deceiver in our lives, trying to keep us from the blessing that God has in store for us. It's the same blessing that God gave to Adam, that God gave to Noah, that Christ gave to his disciples. It's the same blessing that we get to enjoy today. Work that we do not for ourselves, but for God. That's a lesson that we have for today. I hope you're able to get something out of it. Until we can meet again, God bless. Now let's see if my computer will actually render this video.